Welcome back to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey. Okay, there is a famous quote from Nikola Tesla. You may live to see man-made horrors beyond your comprehension. I am going to repurpose this in light of current events. What we are witnessing with United States immigration policy at the hands of Joe Biden and Alejandro Mayorkas are government-made horrors beyond your comprehension. And in this episode, I'm going to walk through some of the most appalling facets of immigration policy. These are things that are beneath the dignity of a first world country: corruption, trafficking, and abuse enabled with taxpayer money. Complete repurposing of the institutions of government to facilitate Biden's open borders experiment, no matter the cost, no matter the rising body count, and the trail of suffering left in its wake. So I have done a lot on immigration in past shows. We've covered the big business lobbies that push for endless cheap labor from foreign countries. We've covered the Republicans who are bought off by some of these special interests who end up sharing the same goals effectively as Soros-style activists with DACA and with endless visas and endless refugees as a source of labor to depress wages and so on. We've covered their sky is falling claims that inflation will worsen if we don't do DACA, that all of these various fallacies and lies of open borders extremists who never look at the data, never look at the quantitative effect on Americans' employment, wages, public services misused by foreigners, and so on. And even the manipulated studies of academics who furnish propaganda for these ideologues under the patina of neutral expertise. These are all things that I've covered in previous episodes on the topic of immigration, just to expose how invested these different entities are in maximizing the number of people coming to this country, no matter the downside. Of course, most shocking of all is the role that our government plays in bringing illegal immigrant minors, resettling them at times in areas that demand huge volumes of cheap foreign labor, like meatpacking towns and other big agricultural areas, resettling them with dubious relatives who take a portion of their salary from working night shifts in the meatpacking plants. Does this sound like compassionate humanitarian policy to you? It doesn't to me, and it disturbs American citizens who know that our country should be better than this, who know that there are people profiting off of these disgusting arrangements. On This Is Your Country, this is why I explore these issues. This is why I explore who is profiting from some of these backward arrangements and how we can fix them. But even if you have been a longtime listener of This Is Your Country, you've gone through all of these explorations that I just covered with me together. Rest assured, it gets worse. We've got this horrifying case in Ohio of the 10-year-old girl who had an abortion, apparently after being repeatedly raped by an illegal immigrant. And there was a huge amount of obfuscation about what exactly happened, when it happened, what was known when and by whom. And there's a huge cloud of mystery around the reporting of the doctor who performed the abortion and the authorities, the Child Protective Services. It's all an enormous enigma still in many respects, and I expect that more shocking and disturbing details will come out. But this is essential to study because it has morphed beyond being ostensibly an abortion access and an abortion morality issue. The situation has opened the floodgates to an entirely different facet of American politics and policy, which is the deliberate immigration policy run by our government knowingly facilitating illegal and vile things, but doing nothing to fix it and leaving a chasm of horrors in its wake. So let's dive in. As this case of the 10-year-old being victimized by this illegal immigrant was coming out, as soon as it was exposed that the alleged rapist was an illegal immigrant, somehow Telemundo was the only primary outlet with a reporter doing shoe leather reporting on this story, going to Columbus, Ohio, and trying to figure out the details. So their reporter tracked this down, and here's the exchange where the reporter is talking with the woman allegedly identified as the victim's mother. The reporter says, "Did the girl live here as well?" The mother says, "Yes, but she's fine. Everything that they're saying against him is a lie." The reporter says, "And the child, are you related to her or her mother?" And the mother says, "She's my daughter." The news outlet says the woman, who refused to provide her name and concealed her face, states that she has not filed charges against 27-year-old Gerson Fuentes, who is charged with rape. Reminder, He confessed to this on 2 occasions, and it must have occurred when she was 9 years old. Is this normally the way a mother talks about the appalling victimization of their 10-year-old daughter? There are a lot of unanswered questions here that no one in the corporate media seems to be too curious about, because, as I say, it opens up a chasm of horrors that indicts the entirety of U.S. immigration policy, from the number of people allowed in uncontrolled, the alleged humanitarian motives of quote-unquote asylum loopholes that allow for countless people arriving and staying here. We have no idea who they are, where they're going in our country, and the business model of nonprofits that take public money to oversee resettlement, enriching themselves off of these dynamics. As I discussed in a previous episode, there's an effort to avoid putting specific numbers, putting quantitative data behind what's happening with immigration so that it can stay focused only on humanitarian propaganda, framing open borders as a moral crusade. We owe people the opportunity to come to the United States because they come from less advantaged places. And this discourse is designed to obfuscate that countless small American towns have trouble accommodating the new arrivals simply due to volume and the overuse of public services, hospitals, schools, and so on. But even more outrageous, this type of discourse is also designed to obfuscate that this isn't a trickle of one-off unfortunate incidents. You know, a couple dozen children turning up without their parents every year and being resettled with dubious relatives collecting resettlement money to care for these children. The fact is, it's between 100,000 and 200,000 children in these situations every year. That is the size of small cities. It's a matter of practice. It's an inevitable and intentional consequence of the policies that they have designed. Policies that cartels are enriching themselves off of, and illegal activity in which the US government and NGOs that are taking public money are accomplices. So where are these hundreds of thousands of children going in this country when they have been admitted under these laws? Let's review how the government enables this and what they do and the considerations they need to answer for. And just remember, as we go through all of this, Congress could write laws changing this at any time, but they don't. First up, sheer numbers of children arriving without their parents. Where are they going? What happens? And who is funding it? By the numbers, they are officially expecting 161,000 unaccompanied illegal immigrant minors this year. All evidence indicates that they are encouraging this and aiming to maximize it by actually making policies that make it harder to deport or turn away children. And the media actually covers this in a way that comes across as almost celebrating it under, as I've said before, this guise of humanitarian rhetoric. But you can tell from these deliberate policies that the Biden administration's goal is to maximize the number of unaccompanied children coming over the border, again, as a matter of deliberate policy. So in one example of them working to get rid of any obstacle standing between them and the importation of hundreds of thousands of children without their parents. A couple months ago, a reporter noted the CDC terminated a pandemic emergency rule as it relates to unaccompanied migrant children apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border. The move came minutes after a court deadline that would have forced the administration to restart expulsion of minors. So they are working feverishly to make sure that it is impossible to deport a child who is in this country without their parents. And here's the statement that the Biden administration released. Following a public health assessment, the CDC director is terminating, with respect to unaccompanied non-citizen children, an order under Title 42 suspending the right to introduce certain persons into the United States. In effect, this means that unaccompanied non-citizen children will not be expelled from the United States under CDC's order. So even though a court wants to make clear that they can't be doing this, the Biden administration just sort of changed the rules to say, oh, well, that would interfere with our policy of maximizing the number of children who come to this country without their parents, so can't have that, which on its own is a bizarre policy goal. But no one ever asked them, what is your intention with this policy? They have never been asked to account for this, why they are removing every obstacle in between them and the importation of all these children. It's simply inexplicable, yet they are never asked to account for it. So, of course, moving right along, any thinking person, any concerned citizen who learns of this, the volume of children every year, and the fact that the Biden administration is intentionally maximizing it with policy changes, then is naturally disturbed that other countries' children are turning up in droves and being shuttled by the government at our expense all across the country. So then one should ask, with whom do these children end up? Where does the media interest go after we've gotten all these children across the border? Well, the answer is that they are placed with dubious quote-unquote relatives, a term that is now such a stretch that the press have started using the more generic term sponsors to refer to the people that these children end up placed with by our own government. It's interesting because the media will allude to these developments, but they will never give you the full truth of what this actually means. So you have to sort of read between the lines in some cases. And so here you've got Axios writing. This was right as the border crisis was picking up, and you started to have all of these photos of the facilities at the border being overcrowded, and this initial uneasiness among the press that these volumes of immigrants were becoming so enormous that it would be hard to spin the reality to the public. This was in April of 2021, just a few months after Biden took office. Axios writes, government pays for some sponsors to pick up migrant kids. Again, there's that term, sponsors, because they cannot in good conscience call these people, these children's family members. So they write, the federal government has been paying travel costs for adult sponsors trying to get to shelters to pick up migrant children, a Department of Health and Human Services agency spokesperson confirmed to Axios. Officials would not provide numbers, but the policy shift underscores the urgency the Biden administration feels to quickly release kids who cross the U.S.-Mexico border alone and remain in HHS custody. So it's apparent from this article that the Biden administration would rather release the kids to some random dubious sponsor who knows how they got in touch with them, since they're not these children's parents, rather than deal with the bad optics of having these enormous waves of children detained in facilities at the border. So they're not solving the problem. They're just moving it elsewhere, getting it out of sight so that the public relations disaster is minimized. Quote, despite efforts by the Administration for Children and Families to speed up the process of vetting sponsors and releasing kids, the total number of children and teens in the agency's network of shelters continues to rise, recently surpassing 20,000. So remember, that's 20,000 just after a couple months into Biden's tenure. HHS, which oversees ACF and the Child Migrant Program, has been criticized for not doing enough fast enough to lower the population of minors in its custody. Again, that means getting these children out to people who aren't their parents fast enough. Love how Axios doesn't even feel the need to raise that question. They just portray it as though it's inherently obvious that that's the virtuous thing to do, is get the minors out of HHS custody and into homes with people who we have no idea who they are. Migrant child care providers had already been authorized to use government funds to pay for flights for some children being released to family members or other vetted caretakers living in the United States. How do you have a vetted caretaker for an unaccompanied child who is a citizen of a foreign country who isn't their family member? What is going on here? It's not like they're part of an exchange student program. So, and then we're on the hook for paying the travel for this, which is starting to look more and more like child trafficking. But again, this is just another day in U.S. immigration policy, because Axios writes, paying for that travel is, quote, a normal part of the unaccompanied children program's operations, the ACF's Office of Communications told Axios in a statement. So you're dealing with, at this point, tens of thousands of unaccompanied minors, and the office is responsible for the welfare of these children, ostensibly, once they come to the United States, can't even bat an eye over where they're going or who they're being placed with. And here's the icing on the cake. Mark Greenberg, a former HHS official who oversaw the child migrant program under President Obama, told Axios it's a good decision in view of the rising number of kids in custody. Given reports it costs about $775 a day to house a child, covering sponsor travel costs could save the government money, Greenberg said. This intentional omission of relevant details, which is that at this point, $775 is what it costs to travel domestically for an airfare ticket in some cases now that flight costs are rising so much. But the fact is, for him to portray it as though this is some sensible budgetary decision, ignoring the fact that they're clearly loosening their standards of who these children are going to, that the public is on the hook not just for the travel costs that he's trying to compare with the cost of housing them in the border facilities and shelters, but for their healthcare, their schooling, the resettlement money that the hosts are entitled to, all of these things, they're Axios is intentionally omitting so that the reader is not well informed enough to really evaluate what's going on here. So it's just outrageous to me that Axios is acting as if this is so fabulous because the migrant shelters are too crowded. So thank goodness the quick-thinking Biden administration came up with this wonderful shortcut, which is to pay for the random adults to come pick up the children from the shelters. What are we paying for? What is this? What are we subsidizing here? It's also just interesting that they portray this as a humanitarian issue as always, that the most urgent thing is to get these children out of the border facilities where they're being held or sheltered. But the real question to me is, if they've got all of these crowded shelters and these children are not with their parents, isn't the best thing for everyone involved to make policy that does not enable children to turn up at the border and stay here? Because this is clearly not helping anyone involved. And you've got the Associated Press here writing on the same issue about how the U.S. is trying to expedite the release of migrant children, never mind to whom. And they write, unquestioningly, in one case this week, staff at a facility told a woman that she would have to bring a certified check to the airport in order to collect her child, who has been in an HHS facility for 3 weeks. Okay, why is this woman not with her child to begin with? What is going on here? What are we facilitating? Is this even her child? There are so many questions here about what this whole dynamic has going on that even with all of their resources of these giant corporate press outlets, they have no interest in exploring what the truth really is. So you've got the corporate press congratulating the Biden administration on covering the travel expenses for the dubious sponsors to come collect their mail order child at the border facilities, and saying that it's so fabulous and wonderful because it will save the taxpayers money because it costs, $700 a night to house these children at the border facilities and shelters. And it's interesting to me because it makes you wonder, now that the New York City and Washington, D.C. mayors are complaining about how costly it is to have to house and feed and host these busloads of illegal immigrants coming from the border, do we think that Axios will do a follow-up piece on how costly it is to maintain the lifetime free stay that illegal immigrants are apparently entitled to now that the burden has shifted to them instead of the border communities? And in my mind, this constitutes their first ever admission that public money is a finite resource now that busloads of illegal immigrants are competing with their domestic patronage clients. So it may be that Axios changes their tune a little bit and starts admitting that there are costs associated with hosting enormous waves of illegal immigrants. So just to wrap that up, remember the stupidity of congressional Republicans' messaging during that time, where they were preoccupied with the conditions at the border. They were doing these, fact-finding missions, going down to expose how Big Bad Biden was housing children in tents, and how dare you? You better let us look at those facilities. They were trying to play up the element of hypocrisy after Democrats had attacked President Trump over housing migrant children in these facilities, but it was so off base. Instead of saying the conditions in which you are housing these other countries' citizens who turned up on our shores illegally are not to our liking, they should have said, where are these children going to go in this country with public money after they have been trafficked here by cartels and held here by NGOs making hundreds of millions of dollars off of government contracts to house them? And they were just not asking any of the correct questions, which in my mind is a form of being complicit in what Biden was doing, because they refused to engage with the meaningful elements that Americans really needed to know about, that really needed to be exposed. So that is the status of Washington. Obviously, we have no laws coming out of Congress anytime soon to address any of this, which is just shocking and disappointing, but not really out of the ordinary. So, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, this is an open secret of U.S. immigration policy, that there are hundreds of thousands of children who turn up from other countries without their parents, and then they get shuttled all around the country by government agencies, including the Office of Refugee Resettlement in the Department of Health and Human Services. And it is not an unintended side effect. It is a well-known problem associated with our open border. And Congress even tried to investigate investigate this in 2015 under Obama, they basically just got stonewalled by HHS saying, yes, it's so horrible. Now give us more money so that we can treat these children in more luxurious conditions before they get sent off to their dubious sponsors. And I'm not sure what answers we ever got out of this, but it certainly should be on the table for Republicans if they take back Congress in 2022. Remember, I flagged that often these children are housed by resettlement nonprofits and by our own government with dubious relatives in locations where there are industries that demand lots of cheap labor. And I highlighted one Washington Post write-up that was ostensibly covering how, this backward town of white farmers isn't properly adjusting to the demographic change in their town because there are lots of immigrants, and don't they know that diversity is our strength? But when you read between the lines on that Washington Post piece, you can see that the real horrors that they are not fully addressing and unpacking are that these unaccompanied minors being resettled in this tiny town in Minnesota are basically indentured servants working in meatpacking plants and staying with people who aren't really their parents. So that is in a fascinating Washington Post article that I covered in a previous episode, but turns out it's obviously not just a one-off. Clearly this dynamic is happening in other parts of the country, and it's been happening for years. So here's another write-up from the Washington Post. Obama administration placed children with human traffickers, report says. Quote, the Obama administration failed to protect thousands of Central American children who have flooded across the U.S. border since 2011, leaving them vulnerable to traffickers and to abuses at the hands of government-approved caretakers, a Senate investigation has found. The Office of Refugee Resettlement, an agency of the Department of Health and Human Services, failed to do proper background checks of adults who claimed the children, allowed sponsors to take custody of multiple unrelated children, and regularly placed children in homes without visiting the locations, according to a 56-page investigative report released Thursday. And once the children left federally funded shelters, the report said, the agency permitted their adult sponsors to prevent caseworkers from providing them post-release services. Senator Rob Portman initiated the 6-month investigation after several Guatemalan teens were found in a dilapidated trailer park near Marion, Ohio, where they were being held captive by traffickers and forced to work at a local egg farm. The boys were among more than 125,000 unaccompanied minors who have surged into the United States since 2011. Let that be known now that this was in 2016. They were saying it was 125,000 since 2011, but we are now expecting more than that every year under Joe Biden. We are expecting 161,000 unaccompanied illegal immigrant children every year under Joe Biden. Back to the article. The boys were among the more than 125,000 unaccompanied minors who have surged into the United States since 2011, fleeing violence and unrest in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Quote, it is intolerable that human trafficking, modern-day slavery, could occur in our own backyard, Portman said in a written statement. What makes the Marion cases even more alarming is that a U.S. government agency was responsible for delivering some of the victims into the hands of their abusers. Do we think that this dynamic has ceased now that we have vastly more illegal immigrants coming over the border and vastly more public money being dedicated to the business model of resettling them and reshuffling them around the country? According to the Washington Post, the report detailed nearly 30 cases where unaccompanied children had been trafficked after federal officials released them to sponsors or where there were, quote, serious trafficking indicators. Quote, HHS places children with individuals about whom it knows relatively little and without verifying the limited information provided by sponsors about their alleged relationship with the child, the report said. For example, one Guatemalan boy planned to live with his uncle in Virginia, but when the uncle refused to take the boy, he ended up with another sponsor who forced him to work nearly 12 hours a day to repay a $6,500 smuggling debt, which the sponsor later increased to $10,900, the report said. A boy from El Salvador was released to his father, quote unquote, even though he told a caseworker that his father had a history of beating him, including hitting him with an electrical cord. In September, the boy alerted authorities that his father was forcing him to work for little or no pay, the report said. A post-release service worker later found the boy was being kept in a basement and given little food. Does this sound like a humanitarian crusade to you? Open borders is a disgusting, vile arrangement that globalists are pushing on the American people, and it is beneath the dignity of this country. So, as I say, Is there any reason to believe that this type of activity would have slowed down or declined, even in the face of a vastly larger number of illegal immigrant children coming here and a huge amount of public money invested in resettling them all around the country? This is why it is so important to investigate situations like this 10-year-old with these people who have treated her so horribly in Columbus, Ohio, where the illegal immigrant was raping her when she was 9 years old. It is so important to investigate, how do children get in these positions? Who are these people who they are with? And why is the government doing so little to figure out what is going wrong here? This gets at a further issue of who is the government protecting? What are they protecting when they are so committed to the open borders experiment? And you'll notice that one of Alejandro Mayorkas's chief goals, remember, he is the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. One of his primary goals is to protect illegal immigrants from deportation, no matter the cost, no matter the downside, to Americans who are being hurt, in many cases, by criminal activity. Now, this is a write-up in the Wall Street Journal about the Biden administration's goals being held up in court. Quote, the Biden administration asked the Supreme Court to allow it to continue using its guidelines for detaining unauthorized non-citizens after a circuit court ruling blocked them earlier this week after Texas and Louisiana filed suit. Gotta love that new euphemism that just dropped, unauthorized non-citizens. I'm sorry, on this show, we call them illegal immigrants. They broke our laws. They are here in our country doing something exploitative and illegal. They are criminals. We are not using feel-good euphemisms on This Is Your Country. So the Fifth Circuit, which blocked Mayorkas's perverse guidelines, basically making it impossible to detain or deport almost anyone, they wrote, the guidelines focus detention efforts on non-citizens deemed to threaten national security, public safety, and border security. They provide criteria for immigration officers making detention decisions, such as the nature of the crime previously committed and whether a person is of, quote, advanced or tender age, has served in the U.S. military, or has family members who would suffer if a caregiver was removed. One question that comes to mind is, in the case of the 10-year-old who was raped by the illegal immigrant, it makes you wonder, is that why the abortionist listed the rapist as 17 years old on the paperwork that she filed reporting the situation to the authorities instead of 27, which is his real age? Because remember, Mayorkas wants to protect people from deportation, even if they have committed a crime, if they are of, quote, tender age. There are real serious questions here. Additionally, one of his guidelines was if a family member would suffer if a caregiver was removed. So is that why this woman who claims she's the mother of this daughter who has been raped, saying that the rapist is her boyfriend and that he never did anything to hurt anyone and everyone's fine? Like, is someone coaching them on this stuff? Is someone helping them avoid a deportation situation to comply with some of these guidelines that Mayorkas has prioritized? There really is not a clear answer here, but it is such a vile and horrifying mess that the American people and the victims of these crimes deserve the truth. Further in this Wall Street Journal write-up on the court's decision, quote, among other reasons, the Fifth Circuit said the policy relied on improper factors in deciding whether detention was required. For example, it provides that the guidelines are essential to advancing this administration's stated commitment to advancing equity for all, including people of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. Of course, the opinion says such policy concerns are plainly outside the bounds. So let's just be completely clear about what Mayorkas and Biden were trying to do with these guidelines to ICE and to other authorities about detention and deportation of illegal immigrants who commit crimes. In the name of reparations for all of American history against underserved people and people who are poor, it is their policy not to detain, arrest, or deport illegals, even if they, for example, rape a 10-year-old girl. Given these guidelines, would they detain or deport anyone? Is there any crime horrific enough for Biden and Mayorkas to say that person who is here in our country illegally, committing crimes that are hurting people, should be deported and should not be here anymore? The answer apparently is no, because anyone could have been affected by historical equity issues such as poverty and inequality. Of course, this obviously has been swatted down by the Fifth Circuit, but now they want to bring it to the Supreme Court because that is how strongly they feel about protecting criminals who are in our country illegally. Systemic criminal supremacy, one might argue. So Americans deserve answers here, which is how pervasive is this around the country? Protecting people who are here illegally, committing crimes, hurting people, but they are protected by what the Biden administration is doing. To what extent is the media complicit? Remember, initially they tried to obfuscate the fact that the alleged rapist in the Ohio issue was an illegal immigrant. They kept calling him a Columbus man, as if he's, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, and not here in our country illegally, molesting and raping children. One wonders, if you scoured local news for these types of stories, how often is the person committing these crimes identified as an illegal immigrant? How often are they, on the contrary, protected by people who do not want the pervasiveness of this issue to be exposed, who do not want Americans to know that their government's immigration policy is, by design, protecting violent criminals from deportation? So finally, the last horrifying piece of this is, what was Child Protective Services doing in this Columbus County when there was clearly this situation with the 10-year-old needing an abortion and questionable situation with the mom living with the rapist who's the boyfriend? It is such a mystery about why the girl is still living with the mom, and apparently the boyfriend is living there too, or is there a lot, and there's other children living in the apartment. This is unheard of. And it makes you wonder if they were deliberately protecting this arrangement because of the illegal immigration issue. If they think that they're doing something virtuous, these people would be deported if it came to light that the mom was letting the boyfriend rape the 10-year-old. Who is doing this and why? This issue of the status of the children in this scenario has been covered in this article by PJ Media, where they have made efforts to contact the Child Services Agency in Franklin County, which is in charge of Columbus, Ohio, and they're getting stonewalled by this Child Services Agency. So PJ Media writes, in response to our question asking if the children in the household were taken into state custody on June 22nd when one of the children was found to be pregnant, this person working for the agency said, I don't have that information. I would have to check and see. About an hour later, we received this reply from Franklin County Children's Services, not from their legal department, but from an administrative assistant. Quote, we have received your request for information, and additionally, you asked whether the agency had custody of the youth you make reference to in the questions below. Thank you for your inquiry. Children's Services agencies are prohibited from sharing case-specific information pursuant to Ohio Revised Code, blah, blah, blah. The article continues, phone calls made to follow up on the statement were not answered. It is highly unusual for a county agency not to answer either yes or no to the question, do you have custody of these children? Especially in a high-profile case like this one, after being hit with media requests for a better part of a week. I asked if the county had put together a statement about this case for the public, and she responded, no, and I apologize that at this time I don't have a comment for you. The article continues, normally, a county office would make a statement assuring the public that protocols are being followed and that the child is safe. The public has a right to know if Ohio's child abuse protocols were followed and if government agencies have acted in the interest of the child and any other children in harm's way. When there is a rape of a child that is confirmed by pregnancy, it is unheard of for that child to remain in the home during an investigation. PJ Media spoke to 2 sexual abuse nurses from states outside of Ohio who said a child in that situation should not have been released home from the hospital where she was seen for the abortion. The public should demand to know what happened here because it's their tax dollars paying for these agencies. And if the agencies are failing sexually abused children, the taxpayers have a right to know and demand changes. So, as I'm speculating, it's very odd for all of these entities to be obfuscating to such an extent, to be acting seemingly with goals that are not straightforwardly protecting the child who is a victim in this situation and other children in the household. It's bizarre, it's inexplicable, and they will not answer to the public for many of these inconsistencies and oddities about this story. I think that this is something that Americans should remain skeptical about because If it is the case that they're obfuscating deliberately because of the indictment of our dysfunctional immigration policy that this story would expose, then there are a lot of other ways that they are going to be lining up to protect this dynamic. And in just one example, this week, there is an article in the Washington Post saying, quote, Arlington, Virginia adopts policy limiting cooperation with immigration officials. Quote, Arlington County this week adopted a trust policy that severely limits the instances in which the county can cooperate with federal immigration agents, a measure meant to encourage undocumented residents in the Northern Virginia suburb to seek help from police and use other government resources. To me, this sounds like protecting the immigration policy of the Biden administration that is potentially putting people at risk of illegal immigrants who are committing crimes, because that is where they're so careful to sever the relationship between local law enforcement and federal immigration agents so that they can minimize public knowledge of who is committing these crimes and exposing the people committing these crimes to scrutiny and to consequences. Undergirding my suspicion here is this anecdote they cite for why this policy change is justified. They pointed to events following an August 2019 vehicle crash on Columbia Pike, in which a motorist was deported following an interaction with Arlington police. Get this. The man was not able to offer up a U.S. license and offered other identifying documents instead, which police suspected were fake. Officers conducted a background check that revealed he was a deported felon, prompting them to contact ICE, who then picked him up at the scene. Remember, this is who they want to protect with this type of policy change. Quote, under the trust policy, Arlington police can now only contact ICE if they have arrested someone for a violent felony or in some limited situations involving community safety threats, terrorism, or human trafficking and street gang offenses. Officers must now also receive permission from a supervisor to contact ICE, and under a law passed last year, cannot arrest someone for failing to show ID. And then one of the hideously twisted activists involved here, who runs an organization offering legal representation to low-income residents facing deportation proceedings, the article cites him as saying that Arlington should have taken a cue from Fairfax County in Virginia, which last year banned police and all county staff from contacting ICE in any situation. So let's just be clear. That is where this is going. If there are more local stories that get out that these are the people committing crimes in certain communities, and in many cases, horrific, awful, vile, disgusting crimes like raping children, this is who they are protecting. This is who they are reorganizing and reorienting law enforcement to serve and to protect. I suspect that we will see more of this type of policy change in different blue counties across the country who are deeply invested in protecting this narrative. And I suspect we will even start to see more calls to loosen child abuse laws and to say that the laws dictating children being taken away from quote unquote parents are too harsh and too strict because it's affecting illegal immigrants inequitably. And look, this is where it's going. I've already seen a couple of stories seeded this week about how child abuse laws in this country are too strict and too harsh, and children are being unjustly taken away from their parents, which surely is true in certain cases, but I guarantee you that that is where this narrative is going next, because they want to protect this dynamic of children being housed with dubious sponsors, which is an integral part of our immigration system under the sickos of the Biden administration. It's clear from this situation with the poor girl in Ohio that the media does not want to touch the specifics of these types of stories, because if it's as bad as it seems, it blows this whole immigration thing wide open, exposes the extent of what Biden and Mayorkas are enabling, and they are not going to be able to put the genie back in the lamp once Americans see what their public money is funding. In closing, all of this abuse of public resources and subversion of justice for deranged immigration policy is beneath the dignity of this country. At one point, they were even issuing a call for NASA workers to volunteer at the border to babysit all these children coming across. Americans should be outraged that this is ballooning into something so abjectly disgusting, something so totalizing that it is colonizing other parts of our policy and budget, that you are taking workers from different government agencies to babysit the children that Biden is bringing here. You cannot claim to be doing something humanitarian when it is enabling something so vile and so destructive. They are humiliating our country with this vile mess of abuse. They're enabling a business model on both sides, the cartels bringing people here and the NGOs receiving them, resettling them with dubious strangers. And remember, Congress could make laws fixing this, cutting off the funding to NGOs and dealing with the Biden administration's open borders experiments at any time. They could investigate it, they could defund it, they could fix it, but they don't. This is your country. I hope you found this exploration of Biden's immigration policy, what it's encouraging and what it's protecting, to be informative. Thank you for listening to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey. Be sure to subscribe, leave an effusive 5-star review about how this is the best podcast you've ever heard, and find more real-time observations by following me on Twitter at Midwesterner with an EUR at the end.